Have you ever heard of the Faceless Man? No, not that show with Patrick Wilson. I'm talking about a legend that predates that show by centuries. The Faceless Man, as you might guess from the name, is a creature that appears as a gaunt, hairless man with no face. What little is left of his features are caked in dirt and dried blood. In some tellings, he wears a tattered dark suit. In others, he is naked. The one constant is his unsettling grin. Some say the sight of his smile alone is enough to drive someone insane. In today's video, we'll look at these tailies and explore the dark places where legends come to life. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is based on an account by Aaron. It comes from an episode called The Faceless Man from the horror podcast, the No Sleep podcast. I'll place the link to the full episode in the description below. How much of this story is true? I can't say, but that's part of the fun of this series. Let's meet Aaron. The night before, we had finished a late-night frisbee session. We were tired and ready to go to bed. One of my roommates, we'll call him Mike, stayed up with me to watch a movie. On this particular night, it was an old black and white Dracula movie. We watched it alone because the rest of our friends were sleeping. I remember laying in bed, listening to the crickets and staring at the ceiling as the hours passed. The night was still warm, the kind of warm that doesn't feel right in September. Around 3:30 a.m., we both heard a noise at the front door. I thought it was just my cat coming in from the porch. It was the kind of night he'd be out hunting. This was a big house with 2 doors. The main one was often left unlocked. In fact, it was summer and we never locked any of the doors. We never had any problems. But that night I woke up just to hear a thump, a loud thump, like somebody had put their foot down hard. Mike asked, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I replied. Wonder if it was just my cat. And we went back to sleep. About 15 minutes later, the commotion started again. First, a banging noise, then a whisper. The whispering got louder and clearer. Then we heard footsteps in front of our door. My dog started barking. Mike and I yelled at the top of our lungs, "Get away! Get away!" The footsteps outside the door immediately stopped, but my dog kept barking for about 5 minutes. Finally, he fell silent. And about 3 minutes later, the commotion at the door began again. Mike and I yelled again, "Get away! Get away!" It was the same pattern as before. The footsteps stopped. Then we heard heavy breathing. The breathing got louder and louder and more angry. Mike and I started laughing because it was getting pretty ridiculous. Was it a raccoon? Who knows? It wasn't worth checking. We went back to sleep. This happened 3 times total. After the 3rd time, we didn't hear anything for the rest of the night. In the morning, we checked the door. It was locked. "That's weird," Mike said. "We didn't lock it last night." We walked outside to check the porch in the yard. There was no sign of anybody or anything. The next night, Mike and I were home alone again. The rest of our friends were out of town for the weekend. The next night, we didn't hear anything. But the night after that, the activity started again. Mike and I laughed it off. We cracked some beers and watched a movie. We didn't bother to close the door. About halfway through the movie, we heard footsteps outside the door. It was the same sound as before, dragging and slow. Mike and I just looked at each other and shrugged. "Well, here goes nothing," he said. We opened the door. There was nobody there. I mean, there was no one there, but there were definitely footsteps. Mike and I started walking out onto the porch to try to find the source of the sound. As we stepped out into the light, we both saw him. He was standing at the bottom of the steps of our porch. He was a thin, gaunt man wearing a dark suit. He was barefoot. I remember thinking how dirty he was. The street lamp illuminated his face and revealed a shocking sight. He had no face. Well, it was more accurate to say he had the shape of a face, but it was smooth. It was the texture of a candle. It was also wet. I could see blood trickling down his non-face. Mike and I stared at him, and he stared back. There was a slight grin on his non-face. I'm trying to describe the details, but words won't do justice to how ugly this man was. The few features that distinguished this thing from a wax dummy were the remnants of his eyes. They were sunk deep into his skull and were shaped like crescent moons. They glistened like oil on water. I wanted to ask him who he was, but I couldn't make a sound. Mike was whimpering. I don't think he could either. The man continued to stare at us with his soulless gaze. Time seemed to stop. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I remember thinking, is this guy dangerous? The man took a step toward us, then another. Still grinning, he continued his assault. Mike and I began to scream as loud as we could. The man's head jerked toward the sound. He cocked his head to the side and continued his approach. I remember thinking, oh my God, he can hear us. The man was now maybe 4 steps away from us. My mind raced. Do I run? The man was nearly upon us. I made my decision. I ran. I recall sprinting through the woods surrounding our house. Branches whipped at my face. Thorns tore at my clothes, scrambling over rocks and roots. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. I could hear the man's heavy breathing behind me. I ran until I thought my lungs would explode. When I finally slowed down, I realized I was in an unfamiliar area of the woods. I was alone. Relief flooded me, but it quickly faded. Fear gripped me. Where was Mike? Where was that man? I started walking toward what I hoped was the road. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I saw him again. He was sitting on a log. I froze. He was looking at me. He gestured with his finger for me to come closer. I wanted to, but fear routed me to the spot. He stood up and continued to gesture with his finger. Slowly, I began to walk toward him. As I approached, he smiled wider. I stopped. Who are you? I croaked. He didn't reply. He just kept grinning. I tried again. Who are you? Why are you here? He continued to stare at me. It seemed like an eternity. The trees around us swayed in the breeze. Birds sang. Nature carried on, oblivious to our encounter. Then he pointed to himself and said, Nick. He paused. You? I responded. Aaron. Good, Nick said. He paused. Come, I hesitated. Should I follow him? What if he wanted to hurt me? But his tone was calm. I trusted something about him. I nodded and followed him into the darkness. As we walked, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I felt a sense of peace, a strange feeling of connection with this strange man. We walked in silence for a while. Suddenly, he quickened his pace. He broke into a run. I matched his pace, surprised by my own strength. He skidded to a halt at the edge of a clearing. Standing before me was a magnificent sight, a beautiful house bathed in golden light. I gasped. Nick smiled. Home, he said. Come. He extended his arm toward me. Let's go in. I reached out to take his hand, but as our fingers met, the world dissolved into blackness. When I woke up, I was lying on the forest floor. I sat up, disoriented. What had happened? Had I dreamed it all? I stood up and brushed myself off. As I turned to leave, I saw a dark shape in the trees. I froze. It was Nick. He beckoned for me to follow him. I wanted to, but common sense prevailed. I shook my head. No, I said. Nick's expression changed. His eyes filled with sorrow. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off me. Then he vanished into the trees. I never saw him again. After that day, I never went back to that house. It was torn down. A year later. Now, whenever I hear a knock on my door in the middle of the night, I remember Nick's sad eyes and the house that wasn't really there. Thanks for watching. Do you think Aaron's story is true? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Until next time, stay safe.